The conversion of Saul. Saul was raised in a Gentile city called Tarshish. He was raised in a Jewish community in the home of a Pharisee. His father was a Pharisee. So when the time came for Saul to go to Jerusalem to get his education, he was educated by a famous Pharisee, Gamaliel, which I think is interesting because Paul's teacher, one of the writings that he had was a writing where he was encouraging the Jewish people to be more tolerant of Gentiles. So even in this, God was preparing Saul to become the apostle to the Gentiles. This young man wanted to make a name for himself, and so he got involved in the persecution of Christians. Even took that 175-mile trip up to Damascus. And of course, as the story goes, that's where he meets Christ. Now, after he meets Christ, he is taught by the local Christians there. And then he goes out and preaches to the Jews. Now the question comes, somewhere in this area right here, he takes a trip to Arabia. Luke doesn't mention it. It's nowhere in the book of Acts. Matter of fact, we don't even know about it until Paul refers to it years later in the book of Galatians. Why is that? Why doesn't Luke mention it? And when did he actually do it? Well, I think this is one of the two times when gentleman Dr. Luke, what I call lifts the quill and doesn't include something. There's in the book of Acts, as much as I can see, this happens twice. This is one of the times, and then later on. I think in both of these cases, Paul basically said, don't write about that. That's just too personal. It's really not pertinent for what you're trying to get across here. So Luke, being the gentleman, lifts the quill and doesn't write about it. But then when? Well, it could happen in two places. It's what I call the pre-basket and the after-basket. There was a time when the Jewish people wanted to kill Saul, so they Christians, and they blocked all of the gates. So they had to let him over the wall in a basket. Well, before that experience, Luke writes that after he was taught of the Jews, of the Jewish Christians, and he went out and preached to the Jews, he said after many days, they wanted to kill him. After many days, we think it could be, 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 months, but it could be 2 or 3 years. And so he would leave and go and then come back, because it says that he went back. The other time is after the basket. It doesn't say that he went directly to Jerusalem. It only says when he arrived in Jerusalem. So he could have gone to Arabia, come back, and then onto Jerusalem. Personally, I believe it happened in the pre-basket when he was shortly after he was being taught. Well, doesn't matter, but one of the things that I see here as we conclude is I see the stages of ministry. You have the Arabia experience, 3 years, where Paul is taught of Christ. He has been taught the Scripture from the child. Now he takes those same Scriptures and he rereads them and he studies them with the new information that Jesus is Messiah, and to his amazement sees Christ in all of the Old Testament, preparing him to write most of the New Testament. So this is his time of learning. Then, after he goes back and he goes through Jerusalem, he's sent back to Tarsus. Now, this is what I call his quiet ministry. He's not a pastor. He's not a missionary. He goes back to his hometown where he continues on being a tent maker, has a good job, and has a ministry with no flair at all. Then Barnabas, who is at Antioch, goes and gets him and brings him back to Antioch to be like an associate pastor, to be partners together in working with the Christians that are just a big ministry. And this is where Paul learns the ministry, the pastoring ministry, the working with people. After that, you have the first missionary journey. This is where Paul goes from the second man to the first man. When they go out, they're referred to as Barnabas and Saul. When they come back, it's referred to as Paul and Barnabas. And as you see in the whole events of that first missionary journey, Barnabas takes the leadership at the beginning, but by the end, it's definitely Paul. This is where his name is changed from Saul to Paul. Then the second missionary journey, when he goes out with Silas. I call this on fire and burning out. He starts that missionary journey on fire, doing great things for God. But near the end, he burns out. And again, this is where Gentleman Luke lifts the quill, doesn't talk about it, just skips over it. We don't even hear about it until later on in the book of Corinthians, when Paul refers to this time of what he calls the time of weakness. It's the time when he was burnt out. Goes back to Antioch. And then finally you have the third missionary journey, when you see Paul going out, and this time he becomes the great apostle Paul. This is his time of greatness. So you see, he didn't just go to Damascus and meet Christ and became the great apostle Paul. No, he went through stages of ministry like each of us would go through. Well, come back next time when we give you more insights on the story.